On a warm Saturday morning in Atlanta, Georgia, the sidewalks along Peachtree Street were already crowded with people moving between coffee shops and open storefronts. 20-year-old Zariah Monroe walked out of a small cafe with a cup in her hand, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind still half occupied with the final exams of her last year of law school. She was calm by nature, the kind of calm that came from years of discipline rather than indifference, and she rarely noticed the small chaos of a city morning. A few steps away, a heated argument had broken out between two strangers near a parked delivery truck, voices rising over something trivial, and within seconds, a patrol car pulled up to the curb with its lights flashing. Officer Travis McKenna, 35 years old and known on his shift for a short temper, stepped out and scanned the gathering crowd, searching for someone to blame before he even understood what had happened. His eyes landed on Zariah simply because she was standing closest to the commotion, her coffee cup still steaming in her hand. Without asking a single question, he crossed the sidewalk and seized her arm, his grip far harder than the moment required. Zariah did not flinch, and she did not raise her voice, because her entire life she had been taught to meet aggression with composure rather than fear. She looked directly at him and asked, in a voice steady enough that several bystanders later described it as eerily calm, why he was detaining her and what she was being accused of. It was a fair question, the kind any citizen has the right to ask, and it was met with nothing but silence and a tightening hand around her wrist. She had grown up in a household where the law was never treated as an obstacle to fear, but as a structure to be respected, studied, and eventually mastered from the inside. Her father had told her, from the time she was young enough to barely understand the words, that a badge was not a license to intimidate, and that the people who wore one honestly were meant to serve the very citizens they encountered. She had carried that lesson through every classroom, every internship, and every quiet study session that had led her to the final year of her legal education. On this particular morning, none of that history mattered to Officer McKenna, who saw only a stranger standing too close to trouble, and decided, in the span of a heartbeat, that she was guilty of something simply for existing near it. The delivery driver nearby lowered his box slowly, sensing that the tension building on the sidewalk had little to do with the argument that started it, and everything to do with the officer's own impatience. Officer McKenna's face reddened, not with reason, but with wounded pride, the particular anger of a man who believed a badge entitled him to obedience rather than explanation. He did not investigate. He did not de-escalate. He did not offer a single word of justification. Instead, in front of dozens of witnesses on a public sidewalk, he raised his hand and struck Zariah Monroe across the face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound of the slap seemed to freeze the entire street. Conversations dying mid-sentence, a woman gasping near the cafe door, a delivery driver stopping with a box still in his arms. For a moment nobody moved, as though the city itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Then the phones came out, one after another, dozens of them, rising into the air like a wave breaking across the sidewalk. Zariah did not cry. She did not scream, and she did not reach for her own phone to defend herself the way anyone might expect. She simply pressed her hand lightly against her cheek, straightened her posture, and looked at the officer with an expression that unsettled him far more than any outburst could have. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only those closest could hear it clearly, yet it carried the weight of absolute certainty. She told him that he would regret what he had just done, and then she said nothing more, letting the silence around them do the rest of the talking. A young mother standing near the cafe window pulled her child closer, whispering that everything would be fine, while keeping her own eyes locked on the scene, unfolding just a few feet away. An older man leaning on a cane muttered under his breath that he had lived through decades of this city's history and had never once expected to watch something like this happen in broad daylight on a Saturday morning. Nobody stepped forward to physically intervene, not out of indifference, but out of the instinctive caution people feel when an officer's hand still rests near a weapon. Zariah's silence, though, seemed to carry more weight than any shout could have, settling over the crowd like a held breath that refused to release. Even Officer McKenna, standing over her with his palm still faintly stinging from the force of his own strike, seemed briefly uncertain of what to do next, as though her calm had disarmed him more effectively than resistance ever could. McKenna's anger did not fade with her stillness. If anything, it deepened, because he mistook her composure for defiance and her silence for a threat. He demanded that she hand over her phone, insisting that he needed to verify what she had recorded, though he had no legal grounds to make such a request. Zariah refused, calmly and clearly, informing him that she understood her rights and that he had no authority to seize her device without cause. A man in his 50s, dressed in a simple gray suit, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd and identified himself as Marcus Ellison, an attorney who happened to be walking to his office when the altercation began. He told the officer plainly that the young woman had rights that could not simply be waived because he found them inconvenient. McKenna, embarrassed now in front of an audience that kept growing by the second, turned his frustration toward Marcus and threatened to arrest him as well for interference, though the lawyer had done nothing but speak. The crowd, sensing the injustice unfolding in broad daylight, began to murmur and then to protest openly, some shouting for the officer to let her go, others simply repeating that they had seen everything and would not let it be forgotten. One bystander held a phone steady and wide, capturing not just the aftermath but the officer's continued aggression toward the lawyer trying to intervene. Within minutes, the footage was already moving from device to device, spreading through the neighborhood faster than anyone standing there could have predicted. Zariah, her cheek still burning red from the blow, reached into her pocket and pulled out her own phone despite McKenna's earlier demand. She did not call the police, and she did not call a friend to vent about what had happened. She dialed a single number that she rarely needed to use, and when the call connected, she said only one word, quiet but unmistakable in the tension of that street. She said, simply, "Dad." Then she ended the call, tucked the phone away, and stood in silence once more, waiting, her eyes never leaving the officer who had struck her, as though she already knew exactly what was coming next. Nobody on that sidewalk, not the bystanders, not the lawyer, and certainly not Officer McKenna, had any idea who her father truly was. In the minutes that followed, as backup patrol cars arrived and the scene grew more chaotic, McKenna tried to regain control by mocking the very call he had just witnessed her make. He told her, with a smirk that would later be remembered by more than one witness, that she was welcome to call whoever she wanted, because it would change nothing about the situation she had put herself in. Zariah did not answer him. She simply stood there, her cheek still marked, her posture unbroken, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be hunting for. The minutes stretched on, and the crowd along the sidewalk grew thicker rather than thinner, drawn by the flashing lights and the strange stillness of the young woman at the center of it all. Some people whispered questions to one another, wondering who she was and why she seemed so unshaken by what had happened. Marcus Ellison stood near her the entire time, quietly making note of badge numbers and patrol car identifications, the practiced habit of a man who had spent years inside courtrooms. McKenna paced near his vehicle, radio in hand, occasionally glancing at Zariah as though her calmness was somehow more threatening than any anger could have been. More patrol units arrived, their lights adding to the growing spectacle, until the block resembled something closer to a crime scene than a simple street corner disagreement. A young officer, barely out of the academy, asked quietly whether someone should call for a supervisor, uncertain whether the situation in front of him matched anything he had been trained to handle. Another officer shrugged and said that McKenna usually knew what he was doing, though the uncertainty in his own voice suggested he no longer fully believed it. Zariah remained still throughout, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the street corner, as though watching for something or someone that only she expected to arrive. The wait felt longer than 8 minutes to everyone standing there, though later, when investigators reconstructed the timeline from the recovered footage, it would be confirmed as precisely that. Then, without warning, a black sport utility vehicle turned the corner and slowed to a stop just beyond the police barricade, its engine idling low against the murmur of the crowd. The door opened, and a man stepped out, unhurried, dressed not in a uniform or a suit, but in a simple, plain blue shirt tucked neatly into dark trousers. His hair was silver at the temples, his frame broad but weathered by years rather than softened by them, and he moved with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had long ago stopped needing to rush toward anything. He walked past the officers without acknowledging them, his attention fixed entirely on the young woman standing near the center of the scene. He crossed the distance between them in a dozen slow steps, and when he reached her, he did not raise his voice or demand answers from anyone around him. He simply looked at the red mark still visible on her cheek and asked, in a tone so quiet it barely reached beyond the two of them, whether the officer had hit her. Zariah did not speak. She only nodded once, her eyes finally softening for the first time since the slap had landed. The man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and then, with the same unhurried calm, he turned to face Officer McKenna directly. At that exact moment, Lieutenant Helena Brooks arrived on scene, stepping out of her own vehicle with the brisk authority of someone used to commanding a room. She scanned the crowd, the flashing lights, and the young woman, with the reddened cheek, prepared to take charge of what looked like an escalating public incident. Then her eyes landed on the silver-haired man standing beside Zariah, and everything about her posture changed in an instant. She stopped, mid-stride, her expression shifting from command to something closer to disbelief, as though she were looking at someone she had never expected to see on an ordinary Atlanta sidewalk. Without a word of explanation to anyone around her, Lieutenant Brooks removed her cap and held it against her chest, straightening into a posture that unmistakably resembled a formal salute. Several younger officers nearby exchanged confused glances, unsure why their commanding lieutenant would greet a civilian with such reverence. Officer McKenna, still holding his radio, looked between Brooks and the stranger with growing unease, sensing that something important was happening that he did not yet understand. Brooks stepped closer to McKenna, lowering her voice so that only he could hear the question she was about to ask. She asked him, plainly and with unmistakable urgency, whether he had any idea who the man standing beside Zariah actually was. McKenna shook his head, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time since the encounter began. Brooks's face lost its color as she realized the full weight of what had just occurred on her watch, in her jurisdiction, under her command. She did not explain immediately, choosing instead to step back and observe. But the tension radiating from her was enough to silence even the most restless voices in the crowd. Word moved quickly among the gathered officers, passed in hushed exchanges from one patrol unit to the next, until even those who had arrived last seemed to freeze in place. The name, once spoken aloud by someone in the crowd who recognized him from a regional security conference years earlier, rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. Several older officers, the ones who had served longest and remembered old briefings and shared operations, straightened their posture without being told to. It was clear from their reaction alone that this was not an ordinary bystander who had simply arrived to collect his daughter, and that the situation had shifted into something far larger than a single slap on a crowded sidewalk. As the crowd waited and the officers whispered among themselves, fragments of the man's history began to surface through quiet conversation. He was Major Orion Monroe, 48 years old, a name that carried weight far beyond the borders of Georgia. He had served for decades within the most elite tier of American Special Operations, a unit whose members rarely spoke publicly about their work, and whose reputations were built almost entirely on the testimony of those they had once saved. He had been awarded the Silver Star for actions during a hostage rescue that several senior police commanders in the region still referenced during their own training sessions. He had also received the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors the nation could bestow, though he never once mentioned it himself in casual conversation. What made Orion Monroe unusual, even among decorated veterans, was not simply the medals pinned somewhere in a drawer at home, but the quiet respect he commanded from law enforcement leaders across the country. During his years of active service, he had coordinated with local police departments on joint operations more than once, and, in at least 2 documented instances, his actions had directly saved the lives of officers caught in situations far beyond their training. After retiring from active duty, he had not sought publicity or comfort, choosing instead to become an instructor, teaching leadership and counterterrorism principles to a new generation of soldiers and, occasionally, to police academies willing to listen. He never used his past as leverage, never introduced himself with his rank, and never allowed his daughter to mention any of it, because he believed that respect earned through fear was no respect at all. One retired captain, standing near the edge of the crowd that morning, recalled a joint training exercise nearly 15 years earlier, where Orion had walked into a barricaded situation that had already claimed the composure of every officer on scene. He had spoken to the man holding hostages not with threats but with patience, drawing the situation to a peaceful end without a single shot fired, an outcome the captain said he had never forgotten. Others remembered him differently, as the quiet instructor who never raised his voice in a classroom, yet somehow commanded more attention than officers twice his volume. His name had circulated for years in briefings and training manuals used by departments well beyond the borders of Georgia, always attached to stories of restraint rather than force. It was this reputation, built patiently over decades rather than claimed through a single dramatic act, that now stood quietly beside his daughter on an ordinary sidewalk, waiting for an explanation that no one seemed able to provide. Standing on that sidewalk now, surrounded by flashing lights and a crowd that had grown large enough to spill into the street, Orion showed no trace of the anger that would have been justified. He did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for the authority his name carried. He simply turned to Lieutenant Brooks and asked one direct question, his tone even and unwavering, wanting to know why his daughter had been assaulted without cause on a public street. Nobody standing near him, not Brooks, not the surrounding officers, and least of all McKenna, had an answer that could withstand the weight of that simple question. The silence that followed stretched longer than anyone standing there was comfortable with, broken only by the low murmur of a growing crowd, waiting to see what would happen next. Orion's gaze moved slowly across the scene, taking in the patrol cars, the officers, and the phones still recording from every angle before settling once more on Lieutenant Brooks. He requested, calmly but firmly, that the body cam footage from every officer present be secured immediately and preserved without alteration, a request that carried the unmistakable tone of a man who understood exactly how evidence could disappear if given enough time. Brooks agreed at once, issuing the order to her team without hesitation, fully aware that any delay would only deepen the trouble already gathering around her department. Within the hour, investigators from Internal Affairs arrived to begin collecting every piece of evidence connected to the incident. Body cam footage from Officer McKenna's own uniform was pulled first, followed by recordings from at least 3 other officers who had responded to the initial call. The footage captured by bystanders, dozens of separate angles from phones held along the sidewalk, was gathered as well, along with a longer, uninterrupted recording taken by someone standing directly across the street near the cafe's outdoor seating. A nearby shop, owned by a woman named Evelyn Dawson, also provided its exterior camera footage, which had captured the entire encounter from a clean, unobstructed angle above the sidewalk. When investigators compared every recording side by side, the story told by each one matched with unsettling consistency. There was no warning issued before the strike, no verbal command given, no attempt at de-escalation of any kind. There was no legal justification documented anywhere in the initial radio call that would have authorized the use of force against Zariah Monroe, a young woman who had done nothing more than ask a question. Officer McKenna had acted entirely on assumption, then compounded that error with unnecessary aggression toward both Zariah and the lawyer who had tried to intervene on her behalf. As the pieces of evidence accumulated on the desk of the reviewing lieutenant, it became increasingly clear that there was no version of events that could protect him. The reviewing team spent hours cross-referencing timestamps, matching the angle of every phone recording against the body cam footage frame by frame, searching for any inconsistency that might complicate the picture. None appeared. Every version told the same story, from a slightly different vantage point, the way separate witnesses to a single truth naturally converge, no matter how far apart they stand. One investigator later remarked that in years of reviewing use-of-force complaints, she had rarely seen a case with so little ambiguity, so little room for the usual arguments about perspective or provocation. The clarity of the footage left no space for McKenna's account to survive contact with the facts, and by midday, the department's legal advisors had already begun preparing for what they suspected would become a highly scrutinized case. Lieutenant Brooks, reviewing the final compiled file that afternoon, closed the folder slowly and sat in silence for a long moment before picking up the phone to notify her superiors. McKenna, watching from a distance, as officers moved briskly between vehicles collecting statements and equipment, began to understand for the first time just how serious his situation had become. The confidence that had carried him through the earlier confrontation drained slowly from his posture, replaced by the particular unease of a man realizing that consequences were no longer avoidable. He glanced repeatedly toward Orion, who stood quietly beside his daughter, offering no threats and no demands, simply watching the process unfold with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the truth, given enough time, rarely needed to be forced. While investigators worked, Orion remained close to Zariah, occasionally speaking to her in a low voice that few others could hear. He did not lecture her, and he did not comfort her with empty reassurances, because comfort had never been his way of teaching. Instead, he spoke as he always had, drawing from years spent training soldiers who would one day carry enormous responsibility into dangerous places. He told her, as he had told hundreds of young recruits before her, that power existed for one purpose alone, and that purpose was protection, never humiliation. He reminded her that anyone could raise a hand in anger, but that true strength revealed itself only in the moments when restraint was far harder to choose. Lieutenant Brooks, standing close enough to overhear parts of this quiet exchange, found herself unexpectedly moved by the simplicity of his words. She had spent years commanding officers, disciplining misconduct, and defending her department against public criticism, yet rarely had she heard the responsibility of a badge explained with such clarity. Several officers nearby lowered their eyes, some out of shame at what their colleague had done, others simply humbled by the presence of a man whose service record most of them had only read about in training manuals. McKenna, standing apart from the group now, seemed to shrink slightly with every word Orion spoke, the weight of his mistake settling more heavily across his shoulders. Orion continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, explaining that every soldier he had ever trained learned this lesson before they learned anything else, because a person who could not master their own temper had no business being trusted with authority over another human being. He said that fear might produce obedience for a while, but that it always eventually produced resentment, and resentment, given enough time, produced exactly the kind of confrontation the street had just witnessed. He did not look at McKenna as he spoke, choosing instead to address the words generally to the officers and the crowd alike, as though offering a lesson rather than an accusation. Zariah listened quietly beside him, having heard variations of this same teaching countless times throughout her life. Yet it seemed to land differently now, spoken aloud in the very moment it had been tested. Brooks found herself nodding along without meaning to, recognizing in his words the exact standard she had always tried, imperfectly, to hold her own officers to. It was in that quiet, unguarded moment, surrounded by cameras and officers and a still watching crowd, that McKenna appeared to fully grasp the size of what he had done. He was not being confronted with rage or threats, which might have allowed him to retreat into anger of his own. Instead, he was being confronted with calm, measured truth, delivered by a man who had every reason to be furious and chose restraint instead. That restraint, more than any accusation could have, seemed to strip away whatever excuses McKenna had been quietly constructing in his own mind. Before the crowd finally began to disperse, Orion made one final request, addressed directly to Lieutenant Brooks and loud enough for the surrounding officers to hear clearly. He asked that whatever consequences followed be determined strictly through proper procedure, without any special treatment extended toward his daughter because of who he was. He made it clear that he was not seeking favors or expedited justice through his name or his reputation, only the same fair and lawful process that any citizen would be entitled to receive. Brooks nodded, understanding immediately that his request was not simply about this one case, but about the integrity of the entire process moving forward. It was a request that, more than anything else that morning, revealed exactly the kind of man Orion Monroe truly was. The formal review moved quickly once the Internal Affairs Division confirmed that every piece of footage aligned without contradiction. Investigators noted that Officer McKenna had failed to identify himself with a clear command before making physical contact, had not attempted verbal de-escalation, despite Zariah's calm demeanor, and had used force disproportionate to any perceived threat, since there had been no threat at all. His report, filed hours after the incident, contained inconsistencies that did not match the recorded footage, further damaging whatever defense he might have attempted to construct. By early afternoon, department leadership had reviewed enough evidence to move forward with immediate disciplinary action rather than waiting for a lengthy hearing process. Officers arrived at the precinct parking lot where McKenna had returned to complete paperwork, and the process that followed was conducted with quiet formality rather than public spectacle. His badge was requested and surrendered without protest, the metal catching the afternoon light briefly before disappearing into an evidence folder. His service weapon was removed and logged according to procedure, a routine step that nonetheless carried an unmistakable finality. He was informed that he was being placed on immediate suspension, pending a full administrative and possibly criminal review, a process that could ultimately determine whether he would ever wear a badge again in any jurisdiction. News of what had happened spread through the city with remarkable speed, carried less by official statements and more by the sheer number of people who had personally witnessed the encounter or seen it recorded from someone else's phone. Conversations about the incident moved from the sidewalk outside the cafe to workplaces, dinner tables, and gatherings across the city within a matter of hours. What struck people most, according to those who discussed it, was not simply the shocking image of an officer striking a young woman without cause. It was the extraordinary composure of the man who arrived afterward, a father with every justification for fury, who instead chose to demand nothing but lawful accountability. By evening, footage of the encounter, particularly the moment Orion Monroe asked why his daughter had been assaulted, had been viewed by an extraordinary number of people across the region and beyond. It was not the violence of the slap that captured public attention most powerfully, though that alone would have been enough to spark outrage. It was the striking contrast between McKenna's reckless aggression and Orion's unshaken restraint, a contrast that seemed to resonate deeply with anyone who watched it. People began to speak of the video not as a story about police misconduct alone, but as a lesson in what real strength and real authority were supposed to look like. Local news programs picked up the story by the following morning, though the department declined to release Orion's military history without his direct permission, honoring the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the encounter. Community leaders who had long pushed for stronger accountability measures within the police department cited the case as an example of exactly the kind of transparent, evidence-based review they had been demanding for years. Some who watched the footage focused on Zariah herself, remarking on the extraordinary self-control she had shown in a moment that would have broken the composure of almost anyone else. Others focused on the officers who had removed their caps and straightened their posture the instant they recognized Orion, wondering aloud what it said about the culture of respect that still existed quietly within their ranks. Through it all, Zariah declined every request to speak publicly about the incident, choosing instead to let the evidence and the process speak entirely for themselves. 2 days later, Officer McKenna requested a formal meeting through his attorney, asking to speak directly with both Zariah and her father before the disciplinary hearing proceeded further. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room at the precinct, away from cameras and crowds, attended only by Brooks, Marcus Ellison, and a department mediator. McKenna entered the room, visibly diminished from the man who had stood so confidently on the sidewalk days earlier, his posture stiff, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogance from before, only the halting uncertainty of someone forced to confront the full weight of his own actions. He apologized first to Zariah, his words simple and unpolished, admitting plainly that he had allowed anger and assumption to override any sense of duty or restraint. He told her that he had let his emotions dictate his actions, in a moment where a badge demanded exactly the opposite, and that no explanation could undo the harm he had caused her in front of an entire street of strangers. Zariah listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, the same composure she had shown from the very first moment of the encounter still present in every line of her posture. When he finished, she said nothing immediately, allowing the silence to settle before she finally responded. McKenna then turned to Orion, offering an apology far more hesitant than the one he had given Zariah, aware that he was standing before a man whose reputation and service record far exceeded anything he could claim for himself. He admitted that he had acted without any legitimate basis, that his assumptions about Zariah had been shaped by nothing more than his own impatience, and that he understood now how badly he had failed the responsibility his uniform represented. Orion listened patiently, his expression calm throughout, betraying none of the anger that would have been entirely justified in that moment. When McKenna finished speaking, Orion offered a response that surprised nearly everyone in the room. He told McKenna plainly that he had no interest in revenge, that vengeance had never been something he sought even in circumstances far more dangerous than this one. He said instead that his daughter deserved justice, a distinction he made clear was entirely different from punishment born out of anger. Justice, he explained, meant accountability delivered through fair and lawful process, not humiliation delivered for its own sake, and he trusted the department's review to determine what that accountability should look like. It was a response that left even the mediator momentarily silent, unaccustomed to hearing such measured grace from someone who had every right to demand far more. Zariah, watching her father's response, finally spoke the words she had been holding since the meeting began. She told McKenna that she forgave him, not because his actions deserved forgiveness in themselves, but because she refused to carry the weight of that anger any further than necessary. She then added, with the same clarity that had defined every word she spoke that week, that forgiveness did not erase accountability, and that the two existed independently of one another. It was a distinction that seemed to hit McKenna harder than any accusation could have, because it stripped away any illusion that her calm response somehow meant the consequences he faced would soften as well. The meeting ended without further discussion, McKenna leaving the room with his head bowed low, the weight of everything he had done finally settled fully across his shoulders. Outside the precinct, reporters and curious onlookers had gathered, drawn by the ongoing attention surrounding the case, though the department had kept most details of the private meeting confidential. McKenna walked past them without comment, his career and reputation now permanently altered by a single reckless decision made on an ordinary Saturday morning. For those who had followed the story closely, it was clear that whatever came next for him, professionally or legally, would be shaped entirely by the choices he had made that day, not by anything Orion Monroe or his daughter had done in response. In the weeks that followed, the disciplinary hearing concluded with a formal recommendation for termination, along with a referral for possible criminal charges related to the unlawful use of force. The department, under Lieutenant Brooks's direct oversight, also announced a broader review of training procedures related to de-escalation and appropriate use of force during public encounters. Marcus Ellison, who had stepped forward as a witness that morning without hesitation, later remarked in a brief statement that the case demonstrated exactly why ordinary citizens needed the courage to intervene when they witnessed injustice unfolding in front of them. Mrs. Evelyn Dawson, whose shop camera had provided crucial footage, quietly noted that she had simply done what any decent person would do, offering the truth without asking for anything in return. Zariah returned to her studies almost immediately, refusing to let the incident define the final stretch of her law school career, though she carried the experience with her in quieter, more permanent ways. She spoke about it rarely, and when she did, she focused less on the pain of the moment and more on what it had taught her about the difference between power and integrity. Professors who had followed the story privately noted a subtle shift in her classroom presence, a sharper clarity in the way she discussed cases involving civil rights and the proper limits of authority. She never used the incident to seek attention, and she never allowed it to become the centerpiece of her identity among her peers. Her father, for his part, returned to his own routine with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything, resuming his instruction sessions with a new class of recruits the following week. He mentioned the incident to no one at work, and when a colleague eventually brought it up, having recognized him from a widely shared image, Orion simply said that the matter had been handled properly and left it there. At home, in the evenings, father and daughter sometimes discussed the case in quiet, practical terms, reviewing the legal proceedings the way any two people interested in justice might. Zariah found herself drawing on the experience during a moot court exercise later that semester, arguing a hypothetical case involving unlawful use of force with an intensity her classmates noted was unusually personal, though she never explained why. It became, in its own quiet way, one more lesson folded into the larger education she had been receiving her entire life, not just from textbooks, but from the example her father had set on that sidewalk. Months passed, and the season shifted from the heavy heat of summer into the milder air of early autumn, carrying with it the approach of graduation. Zariah had been selected by her classmates to deliver a short address during the law school's commencement ceremony, an honor given not because of what had happened to her months earlier, but because of the quiet respect she had earned throughout her years of study. She prepared her remarks carefully, choosing not to focus on the incident that had briefly made her recognizable across the city, but on the values that had shaped her long before that day ever occurred. Her father, when asked whether he would attend, said only that he would be there, though he made it clear he expected no special recognition or announcement of his presence. On the day of the ceremony, the auditorium filled with families, professors, and graduates dressed in dark robes, the air buzzing with the particular energy of an ending and a beginning arriving at once. Orion Monroe sat quietly in one of the last rows, dressed once again in a simple, unremarkable shirt, indistinguishable from any other parent in attendance. No one around him recognized the name that had briefly dominated conversations across the city months earlier, and he offered no indication that he wished to be recognized now. He watched his daughter take the stage with the same steady calm he had carried onto that sidewalk months before, his hands folded quietly in his lap. Beside him sat an older woman he had exchanged only a few polite words with while waiting for the ceremony to begin. Unaware that the man next to her had once trained soldiers for some of the most dangerous missions his country had ever asked of anyone, she commented, watching the graduates file in, that it was remarkable how young they all looked, to be carrying so much responsibility ahead of them. Orion agreed quietly, adding only that responsibility, in his experience, had very little to do with age and everything to do with character, a comment the woman found thoughtful without knowing how deeply it was rooted in his own life. Marcus Ellison sat several rows ahead, having been invited personally by Zariah as a mark of gratitude for the courage he had shown that morning on the sidewalk. Lieutenant Brooks, though not present in the auditorium, had sent a short handwritten note earlier that week, congratulating Zariah and thanking her, in careful words, for the grace she had shown throughout a process that could easily have gone very differently. Zariah stood at the podium, scanning the crowd briefly before beginning her remarks, her voice carrying the same composed strength that had defined her since the very beginning of this story. She spoke about the responsibility that came with studying law, about the difference between power exercised with restraint and power exercised out of fear, and about the importance of remaining steady when the world around you demanded otherwise. She did not mention the officer by name, and she did not dwell on the details of that morning, choosing instead to speak in broader terms about what the experience had taught her about character. As she reached the closing lines of her address, the room grew noticeably quieter, sensing that something important was about to be said. She told the audience that her father had taught her, long before that day on the sidewalk, and every day since, that real strength was not found in raising one's voice or one's hand, but in remaining calm when others around you lost control entirely. She said that lesson had been tested in ways she never expected, and that it had held firm regardless of the pressure placed against it. As she finished speaking, the entire auditorium rose to its feet, applause rolling through the room in a wave that seemed to last far longer than any other speech that day had received. Somewhere in the back row, Orion Monroe remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else, watching his daughter with an expression of quiet, unmistakable pride, before finally rising to join the applause himself. No camera in that auditorium turned toward him, and no one in the crowd realized that the calm, silver-haired man near the back had once stepped out of a black vehicle onto a crowded sidewalk to defend the very values his daughter had just described. He did not need recognition, because he had spent his entire life understanding that the truest kind of authority never demanded an audience. As the ceremony ended and graduates began moving toward their families, Zariah found her father waiting near the edge of the crowd, exactly where he always was, steady and unassuming, asking for nothing but her presence beside him. They walked out of the building together into the cool autumn air, father and daughter, neither one needing to say much of anything to understand what the moment meant. Somewhere behind them, strangers who had watched her speech were already repeating her closing words to one another, carrying the lesson forward without knowing where it had truly come from. Zariah paused at the edge of the parking lot and turned to her father, asking quietly whether he had ever imagined, all those years ago, while training young soldiers half a world away, that the same lesson would one day carry his own daughter through the hardest morning of her life. Orion considered the question for a moment, before answering that he had never imagined the specific circumstance, but that he had always hoped the lesson itself would prove strong enough to outlast whatever tested it. They drove home together as the sun began to lower over the city, passing, without either of them mentioning it, within a few blocks of the very sidewalk where the entire story had begun months earlier. The cafe was still open, its outdoor tables filled with new customers who had no idea what had once unfolded there. the ordinary rhythm of the city having long since folded the incident back into its own quiet history. Zariah glanced at the storefront briefly as they passed, feeling not anger or fear, but something closer to a settled, hard-earned peace. Respect, as the story that unfolded across that city ultimately proved, was never something that could be extracted through fear or force. It was something built slowly, through restraint, through fairness, and through the quiet, unwavering choice to do what was right even when no one was there to witness it.